Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to let just allow a few more minutes to let some folks filter in. We'll start at approximately 4:05.
But when we get back together, the distinction, the expenditures on the whole everything together.
Okay, everyone. Good afternoon. Good evening. Welcome. It is 4:05, so we're going to get the train rolling here. Um, welcome. My name is Nick Russell. I'm a specialist in the dredging, sediments, and ocean section of the Water Division here at EPA Region 2. Welcome to the second of two public scoping meetings being held by EPA Region 2 for your input to help us develop environmental review alternatives for the continued management of dredged material in the New York Bight. We had a great turnout at our first meeting on Tuesday with lots of actually very thoughtful and constructive questions and comments. Um, the meeting brought together, and we see here in our participant list, a lot of port, estuary, coastal, and ocean stakeholders. And we're excited to share with you and hear from all of you today. So I'm going to go through some logistics in the agenda, and then I will get the meeting started proper. So again, the primary goal of why we're here is for you to provide us, EPA, with comment for the development of an environmental review document that will consider the continued management of dredged material in the New York Bight apex. Just so everyone is aware, as you're probably aware, the meeting is being recorded, and we are going to use the transcript from the meeting to compile verbal comments for the scoping. Please feel free to use the chat, but we will have the question and comment section after the presentation. So please hold your questions and comments after the presentation. We will provide the email to submit written comments. So if you have questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. If you have your formal written comment, we'll ask you to hold that and submit it to our email address that we'll provide here in a few. And please, of course, remain on mute while other speakers are presenting. Unless you're speaking, please stay on mute. So we're going to go through the presentation first and then have the question and comment. So the presentation will entail a welcome from our leadership, go over the agency roles and responsibilities, a review of the National Environmental Policy Act process that we're following, historical background of dredged material ocean management, the historic area remediation site management and monitoring, and the Army Corps of Engineers request for ocean dredge material management, as well as the zone of siting feasibility and some of the alternatives and components that we'd like you to think about when considering your input. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Mark Reese, the supervisor of the Dredging Sediment Ocean Section in EPA Region 2, and Kelly Vega, the chief of the Dredge Material Management Section at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers New York District.
Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Reese. I'm a marine environmental scientist, and I'm also the supervisor of the Dredging Sediment Ocean Section at EPA Region 2's Water Division. Very happy to be here and to join my counterpart, Kelly, from the Corps of Engineers, and welcome you on behalf of the members of our extended team who are also present today, and you'll hear from several of them during the course of the presentation. Over the last 30 years or so, EPA and the Corps have been working together to remediate an area of impacted ocean bottom in the New York Bight called the Historic Area Remediation Site, or the HARS. This site has been remediated by placement of dredge material over areas that have been impacted by previous waste management activities. And we're meeting with you today because we're nearing the successful completion of this remediation project, and we need to plan for how we're going to continue to manage dredge material that up until now has been used to remediate the HARS. The Corps is joining us here today because the Corps has agreed to our invitation to be a cooperating agency in this NEPA review. And so we're looking forward to continuing our partnership with them. So the remediation of the HARS really could not have been accomplished without direct and indirect partnership and collaboration of many harbor and ocean stakeholders. So I just wanted to take this moment to sincerely thank the various entities that have contributed in various ways to the success of the project. I'd like to especially thank the various organizations and individuals that have supported the HARS Scientific Review Panel. The HARS Scientific Review Panel is a group of technical representatives of these various agencies and organizations that has faithfully met with us since the HARS was designated. The panel members get together annually and review data and monitoring plans, and then discuss these data with us to explore management strategies for the site over time. And we cannot overstate how their commitment and contributions have helped us in this process. So a special thank you to all those organizations. Collaboration and partnership with diverse stakeholders has really been exemplary and exceptional over the last 30 years in a variety of areas, not just in managing the HARS and completing its remediation, but in various other areas as well. And I want to just take a moment to acknowledge some of the things that we've accomplished together. And first, early on in this process, stakeholders came together and partnered on a very ambitious project to develop a water quality model to assess contamination in New York and New Jersey Harbor. This modeling effort was a multi-year effort, took an awful lot of effort from an awful lot of people and a lot of cooperation, and it was funded using bi-state dredging funds. And this model essentially provided a very important tool for the management community, the environmental community, to inform management decisions about how to address sources of contaminants in the system, so that we could realize improvements in harbor-wide sediment and water quality goals. And so that was a huge undertaking and a lot of people involved, and was really a great example of working together to accomplish something big. Furthermore, on the dredge material front, stakeholders got together and found solutions over time where we've done some incredible things managing dredge material. We've processed an awful lot of dredge material to be placed at brownfield sites throughout the region. Contamination issues at those sites were addressed by placement of this processed material, and the areas were restored to productive use. Dredge material has been used for daily cover or closure material at area landfills. It was used to address storm damage and provide for resiliency. We've placed dredge material to nourish our beaches or replenish our beaches after storms, to enhance habitats such as artificial reefs and wetlands. So we've really done a lot working together, and all of these successes that we've had really is because we've always benefited from robust stakeholder engagement and collaboration, and that's what we're looking to continue today. I did take a look, as Nick was referring to the attendance list for the two public meetings, and the registrants that are here represent a very broad cross section of stakeholders. There's folks representing our shore communities, recreational fishing and diving communities, our commercial fishing, our recreational fishing industries, our seafood industries, coastal and ocean conservation organizations, port and shipping interests. There's quite a few representatives from our various municipal, state, and federal agencies, and a few elected officials as well. So welcome to all of you. We're interested in hearing from all of you. Your perspectives are important. Please share with us, your thoughts as we describe our project with you. And I just want to take this moment to thank you once again for your interest in this topic and for participating in this process. And I look forward to further discussion with you at the conclusion of the presentation. So I'll just turn this over to Kelly now to share a few remarks as well.
Hi, thank you, Mark. So first of all, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for attending EPA's public scoping session today for the dredge material alternatives in the New York Bight. My name is Kelly Vega. I'm Chief of the Dredge Material Management Section at the Army Corps of Engineers in the New York District. In 2023, General Spellman sent a notification to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to expand the beneficial use of dredge material program. And he identified two key priorities, which were partnerships and innovation. General Spellman also established a goal of 70% beneficial use of dredge material by the year 2030 for the Corps. Currently, New York District has achieved 100% beneficial use of dredge material. To continue meeting this goal, the Corps has engaged in partnerships with stakeholders and NGOs to match dredge material from federal navigation channels with projects for ecosystem restoration. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is committed to the beneficial use of dredge material. Thank you for your time.
Nick, you're muted.
Hey, thanks, Jordan. Since we have so many different stakeholders, we want to orient everyone to the different roles and responsibilities that the EPA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have in terms of the ocean management of dredged material. So when we're talking about the ocean management of dredged material, we're talking about the Marine Protection, Resource, and Sanctuaries Act. You'll hear it referred to throughout the presentation as MPRSA. And it's key to just understand that the Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA share responsibility for MPRSA dredged material permitting and ocean site management. The EPA develops environmental and testing criteria used to determine the suitability of dredged material for ocean management under MPRSA. The Army Corps of Engineers issues permits for projects for the transportation of dredged material for ocean management. The distinction is that the Army Corps also has authority under the Rivers and Harbors Act in terms of permitting dredging projects. However, the jurisdiction that we're referring to in terms of the ocean management is all under MPRSA. Once the Army Corps has a project under development, the EPA must concur with the Army Corps of Engineers in the determination of that material's suitability for ocean placement based upon the criteria that is established. A key distinction in terms of the EPA's responsibility and the scoping process is that the EPA designates ocean management sites for dredged material. And the Army Corps and EPA, especially in Region 2, really collaborate heavily on the management and the monitoring of ocean management of dredged material sites in the ocean. And with that, I shall pass it to Ann Schaefer, who is going to cover some basics of the National Environmental Policy Act.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Nick. So my name is Ann Schaefer. Like Nick just said, I'm part of the environmental review team at EPA Region 2, and I'm going to provide a little bit of background on the environmental review process we're following for this action. So to start, NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, is a federal law that requires federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of the proposed actions prior to making decisions. Using the NEPA process, agencies evaluate the environmental, social, and economic effects of the proposed actions and provide opportunities for public review. Depending on the action and the scale of the impacts, agencies generate a written report called an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, which is made publicly available. In the review document, federal agencies provide the purpose and need of an action, a range of reasonable alternatives, an evaluation of the affected environment, and an analysis of effects. The NEPA process includes both stakeholder and public involvement at various stages. And then, although not required because of MPRSA's site designation evaluations that are required and determined to be functionally equivalent to NEPA, it's EPA's policy to prepare voluntary NEPA documents for ocean dredged material management site designations under MPRSA. Next slide. So this slide just provides a timeline for the NEPA review. We're now in the public comment period of the scoping phase, which began with the notice of intent being published in the Federal Register and will last 30 days until July 14th. As is standard for the scoping phase of a project, EPA is holding 2 public meetings to provide information on the project and solicit input on the environmental impacts and the potential alternatives. After the scoping period is over, EPA will consider the comments and move forward to prepare a draft NEPA document with help from cooperating federal agencies. When complete, a notice of availability of the draft NEPA document will be published again in the Federal Register, which will begin another public comment period, which would either be 30 or 45 days, depending on the level of the NEPA review. Additional public meetings would be held at that time. And finally, after comments on the draft document are considered and addressed, EPA will finalize the document and publish a notice of availability of the final NEPA document in the Federal Register. With a final EA, a FONSI, or a finding of no significant impacts, is also published, and with a final EIS, a draft record of decision is published. Our anticipated timing for these different steps are shown on the slide. Again, the comment period for scoping ends on July 14th, and we are anticipating a draft NEPA document would be published sometime in September of this year, with a final document being published close to the end of the calendar year. Just on the bottom, you can see concurrently to the NEPA process, the MPRSA has its own rulemaking process that includes its own public comment period after the publishing of the draft rule. And so additionally to the requirements of NEPA, EPA is also required to ensure the project complies with various federal environmental laws as applicable. These include the Endangered Species Act, National Historic Preservation Act, as well as some others. EPA will be working with resource agencies and interested parties to ensure compliance with these. Thanks.
So hi, my name is Patricia Pechko, and I'm a physical scientist with EPA's Dredging, Sediment, and Ocean section. I'm just going to run through very quickly the history of waste disposal in the New York Bight. And the reason I've entitled this slide Waste Management is for good reason, because back in the 1800s, the ocean was actively used as a dumping ground for many wastes, including acid waste, industrial waste, paints, chemicals, manufacturing sludges, sewage sludges, cellar dirt, wood incineration. Matter of fact, we've even got some of those. Oh, you can't see it. We've got some of those records here that date back to the 1800s. So on the map on the right, you can see some of the newer sites back in the 1800s. We have some records of them, but these are some of the newer sites. And I think, Nick, you've got the pointer. Yeah, you can see, sewerage sludge, acid waste, cellar dirt, and finally the dredged material management site. So I'm not going to go through this entire timeline with you, but there's a couple of things, that are important. You can see, progression here. MPRSA, the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, was passed by Congress in 1972. We had implementing regulations in 1997. The mud dump site, which had been used since 1914 and designated on an interim basis since 1973, was finally designated in 1984 and used until 1997. But the big thing here is the Ocean Dumping Ban Act in 1988 essentially made it unlawful to dispose of any other waste in the ocean. So presently, the overwhelming majority of the material that's placed in the ocean is clean dredge material. There are a few other things. We have burial at sea, disposal, that's covered by MPRSA, as is marine mammal carcass disposal, things like fish waste. But again, the overwhelming majority of this material is dredge material. And that's pretty much for the New York Bight. It's necessitated by the fact that the harbor is not naturally deep, as are most of our waterways. New York Harbor is only 19 feet deep. We presently service vessels that are drawing 55 feet in water. So in order to provide safe navigation, we still need to dredge. So for a long time, dredging and ocean placement have been necessary to provide safe navigation for vessels transiting our waters. Next slide. So presently, I mentioned that the mud dump site was used formally actually since 1984 to 1997, and about 1995, due to concerns surrounding the impacts of past placement activities, not just dredge material, but all the wastes, EPA undertook a study to determine if there was a need to remediate these impacted areas where prior disposal had been taking place. In fact, we found that there were things that we probably did want to remediate. So in 1997, we closed the mud dump site and opened up what's called the Historic Area Remediation Site to designate, and we designated it to address documented adverse impacts of prior ocean placement activities. You can see the HARS there. It's a 15.7 nautical mile area, square area. The remediation that we talk about to address the prior impacts was to place one meter of clean material above the impacted areas. Remediation material is defined as dredge material that meets current Category 1 standards and will not cause significant undesirable effects, including through bioaccumulation. So that site was designated in 1997 as a remediation site, not as a disposal site, but as a remediation site, a beneficial use site for remediation. From 1997 to 2003, we reviewed the criteria, the ocean placement criteria that we had applied for remediation material and the site. And in 2003, there were revisions to that criteria for the acceptability of placement of material. So we didn't just designate the site, we went back and reviewed the criteria to make sure it was good enough. So next slide, please. And just to zoom in on the remediation, the Historic Area Remediation Site, the HARS, we have 9 priority remediation areas. Each is about 1 nautical mile square. The total is 9 nautical square miles that were remediated with 1 meter of remediation material. There's a buffer zone around the entire area that addresses dispersion from the placement. There are shipwreck buffer zones that are in place to protect potential archaeological resources, and there's a no discharge zone in the middle there that's kind of shallow that we can't use. So that gives you some idea of what the HARS is actually looking at. But the important part is those 9 priority remediation areas. That's where we're putting down material, remediation material to remediate past impacts. And that's, I'm going to turn it over to Jordan Wellnetz, who will now go into the current site management and monitoring. Thanks.
Thanks, Pat. I'm Jordan Wellnetz with EPA's Dredging, Sediments, and Ocean section, and I'm heavily involved in the monitoring efforts out at the HARS. And I'm going to talk through our approach to management and monitoring at the HARS and some things we've learned over the course of the last 28 years. So first, MPRSA requires that a site monitoring and management plan, or an SMMP, be drafted and implemented for all ocean dredge material management sites. SMMPs are reviewed and revised at a minimum on a 10-year cycle. The most recent revision for the HARS was in 2020. And the SMMP provides specific guidelines as to how to monitor placement activities, assess the progress of remediation, analyze environmental conditions at the site, and address any potential environmental issues. In addition to the SMMP, we also have a panel of port and ocean stakeholder representatives. Mark mentioned this earlier, the HARS Scientific Review Panel that meets at least annually, usually more, to provide technical input on EPA and Army Corps monitoring and management efforts. So before being approved for use as material for remediation at the HARS, proposed project dredge material is sampled and rigorously tested following EPA and Army Corps approved physical, chemical, and biological testing procedures. Nick mentioned this earlier when he talked about the roles and responsibilities of EPA and the Corps, but just want to highlight that material can only go out to the HARS after a dredging project has met the stringent criteria and is approved for HARS remediation. After this point, placement grids are then developed to designate specific locations at the site for managing each project. So on this next slide, I'm going to briefly walk through a project example to see what management of material at the site looks like in practice. So in the first image, a placement grid was created for a specific project. The size and the location of the grid is based on the physical characteristics of the project material, the anticipated volume of the material, and the thickness of remediation material needed to provide 1 meter of cover in that location. So scows are given specific cell locations within each grid where they're directed to place the material from each barge. So here you can see the track lines from one barge trip out to the HARS. So the track lines are in black with the actual placement shown in red where the barge was actually open. And barge-mounted draft and position recording equipment and third-party inspectors are also used to ensure strict compliance within the placement specifications. So here you can see a snapshot from the tracking software that shows the speed of the vessel in red and the draft position in blue. So starting on the left side of the image, you can see that as the scow is being filled, you see the draft increasing. During the transit to the HARS, it remains stable, and then the large change in draft position shows the release of the material. And this software is used for tracking and compliance and can also be used for enforcement if necessary. So in the next image, you can see what it looks like once all placements are complete. And you can see very precise placements within each of these grid cells. And then lastly, in the next image, you can see a comparison of the same area looking at bathymetry. So in this example, the material placed was very coarse, rocky material. And in the bathymetry, or actually backscatter here, you can distinctly see where those placements occurred, the raised features that are along that grid. So following project placement, EPA and the Corps regularly monitor sediment conditions in areas that have recently received 1 meter of remediation material. We collect samples of sediment and resident worms and analyze them for key parameters to ensure that concentrations remain below HARS-specific thresholds. The map you're seeing on the right is just an example of post-remediation sampling from a previous survey season where sampling was targeted in areas in the eastern portion of the HARS where placements had occurred recently. So the map is highlighting the green areas, which show where at least 1 meter of material had been placed. And if we find that contaminant concentrations approach HARS-specific quality guidelines in resident worms at any of these locations, an additional 1 meter layer of remediation material is placed over the surrounding area. And we use 75% of our HARS criteria values as the threshold for this type of adaptive management. And when we place that additional lift of material, we're typically placing sand. Additionally, we collect high resolution bathymetry data annually across the HARS to determine the physical distribution and the thickness of remediation material after its placement at the HARS, and to assess remediation progress. So the figure on the left is showing bathymetry from 1998, shortly after the HARS designation. And on the right is bathymetry from last year, from 2024. Comparing the two, you can see distinct changes that show where the material has been placed over time. This is sort of most obvious to see on the western and eastern boundaries with that coarser material. But you can see evidence of it sort of throughout the images. Progressive management of material at the HARS has created a patchwork of different material types across the footprint. And this is largely due to the sequencing of projects. So when different material types become available based on when different areas need to be dredged, and the dilution requirements, which allow for coarser materials like rock to be placed along the margins of the site, because this material doesn't spread out after placement. The figure on the right is just an example of the patchwork of different projects and material types that have been created over time. And in the next image, we can see again the bathymetry where you see some of those same projects. So the orange areas are sort of the easiest to see in the bathymetry. It's a little bit harder to see some of the sand and maintenance muds in the bathymetry, but it's there as well. And in some areas, the placement of deepening materials like glacial till, rock, and clay have created bottom features that have substantial vertical relief. So a good example of this is a project that's not highlighted on the right, but is a prime example, is looking at the western boundary of the HARS. This is an area where rock from the last harbor deepening project that was rejected from artificial reefs was placed. And you can see sort of that whole raised edge of the HARS on the left. So taking a closer look at some of these rocky areas that I was just talking about on the western margin of the HARS, in our monitoring of these areas, we've found that these features have been extensively colonized by a variety of organisms. And we've inadvertently created a lot of habitat and structure here. So you can see from some of these images, corals, sponges, other encrusting organisms, and also some fish in these images. And I'll say also, after having spent a fair amount of time on survey vessels studying the sediments at the HARS, this area sees heavy utilization by recreational anglers. We see a lot of fishing boats out here while surveying each year. On the next slide, we see a similar story in areas that have had placement of glacial till, so mixed variety of different rock sizes, rock, cobble, pebble, gravel. And again, we're seeing sponges, coral, fish, sea stars, a variety of organisms. And on the next slide, in our monitoring, we've also found that the placement of red clay has seen colonization by a diversity of benthic organisms. On the right, it's a little bit hard to see, but the dark rocky looking material in the image is actually a lot of small mussels that are encrusted on the clay particles. We've seen some real benefits to management of native dredge materials at our site. So before we get into some of the options for future management of material, I just want to summarize some of our biggest takeaways from the last 28 years of managing and monitoring out at the HARS. We've been able to achieve very precise management of material. We saw that in the placement grids earlier, and we've verified over time that we can keep our placements very restricted to specific areas. The material, once placed, has remained stable. We haven't seen large-scale movement or loss of material outside the site, including following large storm events. Instead, we're seeing long-term stability. We've had a lot of success with meeting our remediation goals, and our approach to post-remediation monitoring and the adaptive management I described earlier with targeted additional lifts as needed has worked to keep contaminant concentrations below HARS thresholds. And lastly, benthic habitat creation. So in addition to remediating this previously impacted area and reducing contaminant concentrations, we're encouraged to see the kind of benefit that we've created out of the structure at the HARS, and it's inspired some of our management considerations for the future. So lastly, where are we now? To date, approximately 89 million cubic yards of dredge material from the port and its surrounding areas have been placed as remediation material at the HARS. We can see in the green layer again that most of the HARS has been covered with at least 1 meter of material. There's very little left that's not covered in green. The remaining remedial capacity is extremely limited, as I said. Based on the 2024 bathymetry, we're estimating that we have approximately 5 million cubic yards of remediation capacity left, and maybe an additional 4 to 5 million cubic yards of adaptive management in some targeted areas. So that's why we're here today, to discuss options for continued ocean management of dredge material in the New York Bight. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Arshi Natasham with the Army Corps of Engineers.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Arshi Natasham. I am a geologist with the Dredge Material Management section. I work with Kelly, whom you heard speak earlier today. And I will continue the presentations with a little talk about our request to EPA for an ocean dredge material management site and some of the items that were entailed as part of our request. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as mentioned, like with the history of the HARS, we had been seeing, as Jordan mentioned, the different areas that were being remediated and the capacity, the remediation coming to this completion stage. We prepared and submitted to EPA a request for a new dredge material management site in the New York Bight in June 2023. As part of that, our request included a dredge material volume assessment. So we looked at what kind of dredge material that we would be generating going forward and what we had generated in the past. We looked at placement site capacity. So we looked at the HARS itself, as well as other upland areas. And we completed that assessment with a zone of siting and feasibility. And what that means is we looked at an area around the New York Harbor where siting of a new site might be possible and where it was feasible. Next slide, please. So talking about dredge material volumes, we started this evaluation by looking at the history itself. So over time, since 1998 2022, when our request was developed, what kind of projects had been placing at the HARS. So we looked at the volumes coming out of our operations and maintenance projects here in Army Corps. We looked at our new work projects, and these are projects primarily like deepening efforts that we have done. As well as privately permitted projects, which go through our regulatory group here in Army Corps as well. So from 1998 to 2022, approximately 83 million cubic yards barge volume of million cubic yards of barge volume of Category 1 dredge material was placed at the HARS. And so on the right, you see that image, and all those pink that you see are the different federal navigation channels that we here in the Army Corps are tasked with maintaining. So looking at that history, then we kind of use that similar pattern to project out 20 years. And looking at that from around 2025 to 2043, we're looking at approximately 51 million cubic yards of HARS suitable dredge material. That's what we project to be generated over the next 20 years. Slide, please. Thanks. And so looking at what we are expecting to generate, we then shifted our focus to looking at placement. So as you will see here on the left-hand side, we looked at the HARS, and at the time of our request, this was back in 2022-23, we were looking at around remaining capacity at the HARS of 6.5 to 7.5 million cubic yards. You'll notice that number is different from what Jordan had just presented. So that's over time since our request. Material has been continued to be placed at the HARS, and so that capacity, that remaining capacity, has changed. We then also looked at upland and non-ocean placement capacity options. These include, locations such as upland disposal at landfills. We looked at what kind of capacity there is for confined disposal facilities, beneficial use options for environmental restoration purposes, degraded lands or beach nourishment. And looking at all of these, we identified that there's potentially around 22 million cubic yards of capacity available there. So as you can see, like together, this would still be below that 51 million cubic yards that we are expecting to generate over the next 20 years. However, it should be noted that the cost of placement of dredge material at these upland sites is usually an order of magnitude higher than placement at the HARS. Next slide, please. Concurrently, along with our request, we also here, the Army Corps, have been working on preparing a dredge material management plan update. So this is a dredge material management plan is essentially a document and an effort that assesses the regional dredge material placement demand, so the demand to place material where it's being generated, and capacity at these different placement sites. So we looked at the New York, New Jersey harbor as part of this exercise. And this effort also kind of confirmed the same evaluation that we'd made, that there is a need for additional ocean-based dredge material management alternatives. Another aspect of our dredge material management plan update was also looking at changes to how Army Corps would evaluate our federal standard that came about through the Water Resource Development Act of 2020. The key change here is that pursuant to WARDA 2020, our federal standard was the Order 2020 updated the federal standard by explicitly expanding Army Corps' authority to consider beneficial use of dredge material. So we're not just looking at the lowest cost alternatives, we're also required now to consider beneficial use of dredge material when determining our federal standard for placement of dredge material. And then in addition, as I mentioned earlier, to looking at dredge material volumes and placement site capacity, we also looked at, a zone of siting for where it would be possible within a New York harbor for a new site, to be placed. And this ZSF process was used to help determine our where operationally we could do our work, and an economically feasible radius. Because we have a lot of projects in the New York and Jersey harbor, we picked two kind of example projects. We looked at maintenance projects, which typically generates around 200 million cubic yards. And we also looked at some of the larger new work projects, which generate a lot more material, like 2.5 million cubic yards. So using these two representative case studies, we were able to develop a radius. And next slide, please. So as seen here, our evaluation for operationally feasible radius. So this is where it would be feasible for us, Army Corps, to continue to do our maintenance work. Was developed, and we looked at items such as loading times for how long it takes to load a scow with material, have it go out to the HARS and come back. Essentially round trip travel times, how long a dredge might remain idle. And based on this, we kind of identified that a safe radius for us to continue to be able to operate is around 40 miles from the center of a central area in the New York harbor. The other side of this is the economic side. So as I'd mentioned earlier, we typically with placement at upland site, the cost is an order of magnitude higher than placement at the HARS. So as part of economic feasibility, we took all the parameters that we identified in the operational feasibility, and we put it into our independent government estimate calculation tool and developed some cost estimates. And what we noted was that between placement at the HARS and upland, we're looking at, say, for example, a project over our 20-year projection volume of, say, 26 million cubic yards for our maintenance material. The cost would change from 469 million to around, 2,000 to 4,000 million when it was going upland. Similarly, we observed something similar when it comes to our new work and new work projects, where that 22 million cubic yards that we would be estimating, we were projecting for 20 years, would be looking at 396 million for HARS versus 2,000 for upland placement. So with all this in mind, we presented to EPA this radius, but then, however, there are other considerations within this 40-mile radius, which our EPA colleague, Lindsay, will cover in discussing what other considerations there were found within this 40-mile radius. So I'll pass it on to Lindsay.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Adamczyk. I'm a physical science with EPA's Region 2's Dredging Sediments and Oceans section. I do a lot of data management and GIS for our dredging and site monitoring work. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about some of the initial work that we did in response to Army Corps' request that Arsheen just described. So Army Corps' request established a few things. First of all, it established a need for an ocean site for the continued management of stringently tested and approved dredge material. It also established that that site would need to be located somewhere within the zone of siting and feasibility, or ZSF, which Arsheen just had shown on her previous slide and is also shown here on the as a red line here. And again, that's the area within which it would be feasible to have a dredge material management site. But in looking at this New York Bight ZSF, we know that it's a very busy place. It's full of shipping activity, fishing activity, habitat, cultural resources, et cetera. And so in thinking about where an ocean management, dredge material management site could be located, we would definitely want to minimize potential conflicts with these uses, existing uses of the ocean. So to identify those areas, we did a preliminary screening using publicly available data. And you can see all of that data overlaid here on this map. I'll detail it a little bit more on the next few slides, but for now, what you can see by looking at the overlay of all the data together is that some of the areas which still appear to be the gray of the background do not seem to have conflicts, at least according to this preliminary screening using publicly available data. So the three largest of those available areas are outlined in pink here, labeled A, B, and C. So these are areas of interest because they minimize these potential conflicts. So these boundaries are not potential sites. They are just areas within which we believe a site could be located because they minimize conflicts. Yeah, so here I will talk about some of the data sets we looked at. One of them is a depth limitation. So this was derived from a regional bathymetry data set. And the goal here was to rule out any locations that are too shallow for a dredge material management site without the potential for mounding of material to create a navigational hazard or for the potential of resuspension of material. So essentially everywhere that you see brown on this map would not be a location to consider for a dredge material management site. Then the next slide looks at navigation and vessel traffic data. So these are things like shipping lanes, anchorage areas, high vessel traffic areas, essentially activity that we wouldn't want to interfere with in thinking about dredge material management operations. Our next slide shows resources and obstructions. So these are features like borrow areas, lease areas, cable routes, cultural resources like shipwrecks. Again, things we wouldn't want to interfere with when having a dredge material management site. And then the next slide shows habitat. So these are features like artificial reefs, marine protected areas. There's a canyon feature between areas B and C. Once again, areas that we would not want to interfere with. So again, all of these data sets were overlaid to create these three boundaries. We also overlaid these areas of interest on fisheries data sets. So the top left here, you see New Jersey Prime Fishing Grounds, and then the bottom right, you see Vessel Monitoring Systems or VMS data, which this one shows all VMS data. So it's sort of a compilation of all the fisheries that the VMS data looks at. Essentially, it shows where the fishing vessels are spending the most time, the blues and greens being the least amount of time, the reds being the most amount of time. And while the all VMS data set is shown here, we also looked at some of the individual data sets, the ones listed on the slide here. And so all of this data would certainly be considered if we were to narrow down any of these areas further into considering a site within one of them. So I think that wraps up everything that I wanted to talk about in terms of narrowing down that zone of siting and feasibility that was presented to us in Army Corps' request. So with that, I'll pass it to Mark Reese.
Thank you, Lindsay. I know there's a lot there to digest. There's been a lot of work We've done the best we can to try to distill it in a way that would assist you in evaluating what we're thinking about and understanding the types of information that we're considering that inform our potential alternatives. So we're very interested in hearing your thoughts about what we're considering. All of these options that I'm going to describe are things that will be further explored and documented in the environmental evaluation. So I will describe a few of the things we're talking about, but I just wanted to take a moment and talk about some of the considerations before we get into the specific alternatives that are being considered. The first point that I'd like to sort of emphasize is that there are no relaxation of standards being contemplated for the dredge material. The quality standards would be maintained. We have been asked, and what we are trying to plan for is continued management of the same materials that we have been managing for the last 30 years at the HARS. We're not looking to expand the universe of material that's eligible. We're not looking to relax any standards. By this way, we want to, sort of ensure predictability for our port and our dredging community, and at the same time ensure that we are continuing to achieve the goals that we have for the system. So that's the first thing I just wanted to make sure that we emphasize there. When we go through and evaluate these alternatives, we're going to be looking at the impacts of them, the various impacts, environmental, social impacts of them, but also the benefits. And we'll be weighing them against each other for any alternatives that are retained in the analysis. So the other thing we have to think about when looking at the alternatives is, what is the material that, what are we tasked with? What is it that we have to manage over the next 20 years? So Arsheen described the material, and I'm going to break it down a little bit more. The volume of material that we're talking about totals 51 million cubic yards of dredge material that meets the standards. So there's additional material that's going to be removed that's being managed elsewhere, but we're talking about the material that we're projecting to actually meet the standards that would have been managed at the HARS over the last several decades. So of these 51 million, 29 million cubic yards will result from the maintenance of navigation depths within the channels and other navigation features within the system. We refer to that as maintenance dredge material. Much of these are silts and clays, muds, but about approximately 3 million of this 29 million total will result from dredging of the entrance channels like Ambrose Channel or Sandy Hook Channel. And so that will be mostly sand materials. So while that's sort of what we're being tasked with, there's the potential for some of that material to be redirected onto beaches as it has been in the past. But potentially it could also, some of it may not align with beach nourishment projects and may have to be directed to the HARS as well for management. But so we got 29 million cubic yards of maintenance dredge material. We expect 26 million or so of that total to be comprised of muds from various projects throughout the system. The remaining volume of the 51 million cubic yards will result from deepening and widening projects, improvements that are planned for the harbor over the next 20 years. So these 22 million cubic yards of material will include, sands, various types of rock, till, glacial tills, which is, as Jordan described, sort of a mix of materials, which can be, embedded with some clay, but it can be gravel and things like that, and clay. So about a quarter of that total is going to be rock that will be ineligible, or at least to date has been ineligible for placement at artificial reef sites. That's the reason why we've received some of that rock at our site over the last 30 years, because it had been rejected from the artificial reef sites because it's just not the right size or whatever their selection criteria are. But we expect that approximately a quarter of this 22 million cubic yards will be of materials that we will have to manage at the HARS, and that will be constituted of glacial tills, clays, and what we refer to as moderately hard rock. So thank you. So in developing, potential alternatives for consideration, we drew on the years of monitoring that we've had and the experiences we've had, and the siting work that Lindsay just described to you, and that informed our selection of alternatives. So under NEPA, you're required to look at a no action alternative as part of the evaluation of alternatives. So the no action alternative here would be, completing HARS remediation, and then taking no further action to provide for ocean management of, HARS suitable dredge material into the future. Clearly the reason why we're in this process is because that has, serious economic ramifications for the viability of the port long term. And so that's why we're here in this conversation with you to talk about what we're doing so that we can plan for the future. Sort of on the other extreme of taking no further action would be, designating a dredge material disposal site, not a remediation site, a dredge material disposal site outside the HARS boundaries. We've narrowed it down to that site would be somewhere within those 3 polygons as it minimizes conflicts, but that's another option that is an alternative. I want to just take a moment here and, state that this is not an option that is going to be actively pursued. It must be discussed in the evaluation of alternatives. However, the MPRSA implementing regulations state that wherever feasible, EPA is to designate sites that have been historically used for waste management. So because of the availability of the HARS itself, that is not an option that anybody on this call needs to think that is going to result from this process, but it must be evaluated in this exercise under NEPA. So moving down, a slightly different twist on that is that we could designate a dredge material beneficial use site outside the HARS. And based on what we know and what we've learned from particularly the placement of deepening materials within the HARS, we know that there is the potential for habitat enhancement. And we also know that based on the history of waste management in the New York Bight, that there may be other areas within the New York Bight that have impacted bottom that also might benefit from placement of clean dredge material over it to reduce exposure to contaminants elsewhere. So those are the 2 options for designating a dredge material beneficial use site that we are going to be discussing in our environmental documentation. And I'm going to describe this a little bit further so that you can better understand what we're talking about in the next few slides. Before they do that, I'll just cover the last alternative. The last alternative would be modification of the HARS designation to allow for continued use after remediation. When I say continued use after remediation and modifying the HARS designation, what we're talking about when we say we're running out of capacity, when you hear that type of terminology at the HARS, what we're talking about is that 1 meter of placement. It does not mean that material cannot be placed to a higher elevation. If you will, there's sort of overhead capacity above that 1 meter. What we're talking about is after we've placed that 1 meter of material, to continue to place material up to some elevation that we know will be stable and will not be resuspended from storms, and that won't interfere with navigation. There's sort of 2 options for how we're considering discussing or the 2 alternatives that we're evaluating this. One would be to modify the designation and manage all of the material into one portion of the HARS. So we would change the designation. We'd say in this portion of the HARS, we're going to continue all of the materials that are coming out at 51 million cubic yards in this one area. There are some practical management and monitoring benefits to be considered. And there's other factors to consider as well. And those would all be, evaluated in the process. The other option for modification of the HARS designation is to manage the MUDs, to change the designation to allow for management of the MUDs in one area of the HARS, and then to manage the deepening and native materials separately. So by the deepening and native materials, I'm referring to those tills and rock and clay materials, as well as the sands from entrance channels that is not placed onto beaches or used for, other uses like wetlands enhancement. And so this would allow us to perhaps, derive some benefit from those deepening native materials and create some habitat, as the slides that Jordan showed suggest is likely. So we could go to the next slide. I'll start talking about some of the alternatives. So the first beneficial use that I want to talk about is the potential for additional remediation of impacted areas elsewhere in the New York Bight. Again, the focus is on those 3 polygons, areas A, B, and C, and we've done quite a bit of work since 2021 in sampling areas that we thought might be impacted by previous waste management activities, or to look for areas that have fine sediments elsewhere in the Bight, because we know that fine sediments is where the contaminants are trapped and where the exposures to benthic organisms are highest to contaminants, or the potential for that at least. So in our monitoring, the figure shows the various sites that we've gone and sampled since 2021. We targeted the area between the HARS and the sewage sludge disposal site, which of course is now a closed site, but had been used for many years. And there's also something not showing up there, which is the cellar dirt site, which is just to the west of where Nick has got the pointer placed. This area here is in a deep area. There's a bit of the Hudson Canyon coming up there, and there's quite a bit of fine sediment in that area. Elsewhere within the polygons, there is fine sediments, and so we've done some sampling there to assess conditions there to evaluate the potential for using HARS quality dredge material to improve benthic conditions. I will tell you that we are going to evaluate this further in this. However, our preliminary review of the data suggests that conditions in these areas cannot be improved by placement of HARS quality material. And so it's not very likely that this would in fact be the selected alternative. If you could advance the slide. The other beneficial use opportunity that we are considering is the possibility of creating habitat outside the boundaries of the HARS, based on what we've learned from this sort of incidental habitat creation that has occurred within the HARS. And we know that, by virtue of doing these comparative studies between our habitats and other natural habitats or artificial reef placed material, that, these are high functioning habitats. There's quite a bit of encrusting organisms of various types. There's quite a bit of fish usage, and there is an extensive amount, as Jordan said, of usage of these areas by recreational fishermen. So since the Corps made their request to us in 2023, we've initiated and held a series of meetings with fish biologists and fishery and habitat resource managers, and the commercial fishing community through its fishery management councils, and meeting with individual groups to sort of describe what we're thinking about and to explore the possibility of pursuing this option, and to sort of just gauge appetite for this option. And in general, there was quite a bit of support for the concept, but there's a lot of uncertainty around, how to construct these features, and in particular, where to site these features was an area of some concern for various folks. But again, there was interest in pursuing this. So if you can go to the next slide. Our inspiration for thinking about habitat creation outside the HARS using this material was, in addition to what we learned about, that there is the potential for developing high value habitat based on our monitoring activities, we were also aware that, up and down the Atlantic seaboard, there are naturally existing shoals that exist throughout the coast. The figure on the left shows an area off of Delaware and Maryland. I'm sorry, it looks like a lot of people are getting kicked out of the meeting and then having to come back in. So I apologize for that, for anybody who's inconvenienced. And the picture on the left shows basically a field of shoals that exists off of Maryland and Delaware. And these are naturally occurring. They, basically reflect various stands of sea level over time. And they could be things like sunken barrier islands in some cases, but these shoals also exist, as you can see in the right-hand figure, within the zone of siting feasibility off of the New Jersey and Long Island coastlines. You can see a field of them below Area B, and all the way to the right, you can see several of them off the Long Island coast. And these areas have been designated by National Marine Fisheries Service as essential fish habitat because fish, differentially use these areas, preferentially use these areas, many species. And, this is not a secret. Many fishermen target these areas, both commercial and recreational, because of their attractiveness to fish and their retention of fish. So, many of these features up and down the coast are impacted by, sand mining and infrastructure projects like cables and telecommunications and, power cables and pipelines and things like that. And, so we just thought, well, maybe it would make sense. And that's what the basis for the conversation with the fishermen and the inspiration for this thought was. Sorry, I'm getting very distracted by all the pop-ups. If you could advance the slide, please, Nick. Thank you. So in our conversations with the fishery biologists, they evaluated the various polygons that Lindsay came up with and, had discussions about this and said, basically came up for a variety of reasons that Area B was probably the best location from a fishery resource point of view for location of one of these, for one or more of these features for construction of a fishery enhancement berm. The fishermen, clearly want to know a lot more about the specific siting and want more site-specific studies before they were prepared to say that, that they were interested in this. But I'm offering this picture here because I just wanted to give an example of what a similarly sized shoal, what the dimensions of something like that would look like, so that you can sort of envision. As Lindsay mentioned, these areas A, B, and C are not the projected or planned site boundaries, but rather that we would be looking to locate any management alternatives within them, and this can give you a sense of the scale. That footprint of the shoal is from an actual shoal that exists elsewhere within the zone of siting feasibility that Lindsay calculated the volume to be somewhere between 10 and 20 million cubic yards. And so we just superimpose it on Area B so that you can get a sense of the scale if we were to just construct one feature rather than, a series of smaller features. So can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. The last set of options, or the last option that we were talking about, was modification of the HARS designation to allow continued management of material above the targeted 1 meter of cover. The first thing we would have to do is specify the area of the HARS. We've done some preliminary work on it. We have to sort of sharpen our pencils on the modeling of this. But clearly, if we're going to manage just the muds in one area, it would be a much smaller footprint than elsewhere. One of the things that we're thinking about, though, in specifying the area is the elimination of the shipwreck buffer zones. I don't know if you, sort of caught on when Pat was introducing the idea of the shipwreck buffer zones, but the basis for these shipwreck buffer zones, and including those in the original designation of the HARS, was very much a proactive sort of preventive thing in the event that there was shipwreck debris in these areas. The reason why they were identified could be as simple as, that's where the Mayday was at some point. But we've done some work looking at what's present in the sites in those zones. And in the case of, Nick, can you show in the case of these two, go to the other one, these two shipwreck buffer zones, there's really no evidence of any shipwreck debris present. Whereas in the other two shipwreck buffer zones, there is shipwreck debris present. We confirm that there is shipwreck debris in those zones. So we are also going to explore the possibility of eliminating those buffer zones from the designation as well. And then lastly, what our proposal and the modification that we are going to be considering is also to, in addition to, consideration of specification of just one contiguous area for all 51 million cubic yards of material, to look at perhaps just citing an area for the muds, which would be a smaller area, and then elsewhere where the remediation has been completed to sort of enhance that remediation by actually using the deepening materials to create habitat features where we have already completed successfully the remediation activities. And again, I superimpose that shoal, so that you can sort of see the scale of it. That's 10 to 20 million cubic yards. Again, we're projecting that something over a quarter of that 22 million cubic yards, or something over 8 million, so maybe 10 million cubic yards of material might be going to create habitat in the HARS. Hopefully the rest of that material we can of the 22 million, we can find a home at artificial reefs or find a way to get it into other beneficial uses as it's sand and rock that's suitable for artificial reef. But some of that may not align with projects, and we may end up having the opportunity to develop, perhaps even more habitat features within the remediated areas. But that's a sense of scale of something that's 10 to 20 million cubic yards. So hopefully that helps you envision what we're thinking about. And I'm sure that there's lots that you all want to talk about. The one thing I would say is that, as I said in my opening remarks, the role of the scientific review panel has really been critical for us to make sure that we're thinking about the right things, that we're not getting into sort of a very constrained way of thinking about our data or about our management. And so any of our options, we would be looking for robust engagement of a scientific review panel in the future to support any of our management options. And in particular, when it comes to the fishery habitat enhancement, it sort of takes us out of our direct areas of expertise. And so that's where I think we would be looking to, try to invite and attract additional representation on the scientific review panel, to include folks that are more familiar with fish biology and ecology, fish monitoring techniques, well, not just fish, but habitat monitoring techniques, and in fact, fishermen themselves. So thank you for sitting through this, and we're happy after the presentation to revisit anything you may have heard to date. Nick?
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so we're going to get to the question and comment section in just a moment. I just want to sort of put a point on some of the key details about submitting your written comments. Again, we are very, very happy that you're interested and in participating in this process. We are looking for your input in the development of the environmental review alternatives for the continued management of dredged material in the New York Bight. Wherever you fall on the issue, please do submit your written comments to region2_MPRSA@epa.gov by Monday, July 14th at 11:59 p.m. And if you could please include NEPA in the subject line, that'll help us sort of sort some of those emails, and we hope to hear from all of you. I just want to acknowledge that, there have been a lot of people dropping in and out of the meeting. I know that's really annoying, and, we just want to assure you, like, the presentation materials and the recording will be on our website, which is listed on the bottom of this slide. I'm also going to drop our website into the chat right now, so you can click on it right away. And so even if you missed part of the presentation and feel fuzzy on something, an element that you missed, of course, ask a question here coming up, but also within the next 24 hours or so, we're going to post those materials. You can review them, and you'll still have an opportunity to submit your comment to this email. I'll also drop that email into the chat as well. So without any further ado, I want to bounce our first question. We had one question come in through the presentation. Oh, I'll just say, please, when you do make a verbal comment or question, when you unmute yourself, if you could just please identify yourself, and if you're affiliated with an organization or just a member of the general public, if you could just sort of note that, so we can record that. So Tim Dillingham in the chat asked a question. The strategic goal was to limit the bioavailability of historic contaminants to the environment, biota, and he's curious if he missed a mention of the assessment of how well the program has done that, in addition to actually covering the site physically. Mark, can I bounce that question to you, please?
Sure. Thanks for that question, Tim. So, Jordan described in one of her first slides that the way the efficacy basically of the remediation is monitored is, through going out periodically and sampling the areas that have received a meter of material, and we collect worms there, sufficient worms to be able to analyze for the contaminants of interest. And then we analyze for those, and that's the mechanism by which we monitor progress towards limiting the bioavailability of the historic contaminants. That the timing of that is done essentially. We wait for material to be in place for a year, so that we're somewhat assured that we've got worms that have resided in the sediment. Well, there's been sufficient time for the sediment to have been colonized, that organisms have recruited to that and have grown in it. But we also want to make sure that they've been in that sediment long enough to have come into equilibrium with the sediment. So we sample these worms and send them to the lab and analyze the body burdens of the worms. And that's the mechanism by which we do it. I will say that we've been very pleased with attaining all of the goals that have been established for the HARs for limiting the bioavailability over time. What Jordan had described at one point was we have sort of an additional layer of protectiveness that we have incorporated into our management strategy. And that is, this adaptive management approach that if the worms are found to be within 75% of, the HAR standard, that we sort of interpret that as there might be some variability out there that we're not capturing. And, potentially, they could be exceeding the goals that we've come up with elsewhere that we just didn't capture. And so if they're above 75%, we go back a year later, we confirm that, in fact, that is the case. And, typically there's been consistency between years. When we do find it to be above 75%, that typically it would be above 75% of the second year. We'll then sort of delineate the area around it by doing some additional sampling. And then our adaptive management measure is to place material over it to sort of knock that down for good. And so for that purpose, we use sand generally for that, so that our top layer in any of those areas that's approaching our standards has been knocked down using sand or something that's very sandy. There are times where we might not exclusively use sand, but but typically that's sand. So, you know, we didn't include in this presentation, you know, a full summary of the remediation progress with respect to the chemical standards, but that's something that we discuss every year with our group of stakeholders, the scientific review panel. And you know, we do have some reports that we can share with you if you're interested.
Great, thank you, Mark. So I've got one hand up here. N Dorsey 219, if you could please just identify yourself and go ahead with your question or comment.
My name's Gus Lovegren. I represent the Fisherman's Dock Cooperative out of Point Pleasant there. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I did have a question as to the I don't know if you guys had the exact coordinates for the boundaries of each of your proposed potential sites. I just wanted to be here. I wanted to put our comments in just to avoid any conflict of land use sites. And I could say right off the bat, area B, maybe the northern quarter or half of it. We don't fish that area, but again, you know, without exact coordinates, I can't guarantee anything. Area C is a heavy fishing area, a heavy productivity area for us, and a very important site. And as for site A, I don't think it's that important to us. And I'm not sure, like I said, I represent the Fisherman's Dock in Point Pleasant. There is a cooperative out of Belford that might fish that area. I don't know if anyone is here representing them, but I don't see it as too heavy of an important to a site for us. But Site C is super important, and the lower half, maybe 2/3 of Site B is also a really important site to us. So I just wanted to get out there and let you guys know. So thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. If you, would be so kind as to also, hit that email and, take that same comment and throw it into the email as well. That would be helpful, but it is noted here as well. And I just will note for the room too, just reiterating sort of, how we're thinking about those three sites. Generally, as Lindsay pointed out, is that these are, areas of potential consideration that we are considering as in these options for the environmental review, and any potential siting within those locations would be a smaller footprint of those areas. But yeah, thank you again so much for your comment, and look forward to working with you in the future, I hope. Let's see, do we have a question in the chat from Tony. Is source and metadata used in mapping data accessible? Did you use and consult with Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal in doing the analysis? Lindsay, can I give that question to you, please?
Yeah, so to start with the end of that, we did look at the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal. Although certainly if you think there is any data set that was in there that we did not consider, feel free to let us know and we would look at it. And then I will also then just direct you to our website, where we do have a link to sort of a report of this this analysis, and there is a link available to every source of every data set that we used, so you can definitely get to all of the sources and metadata there. Thank you.
Tony, did that get at that for you? Oh, signing off. Okay, he said he's going to follow up. That's great. All right, we look like we have. Just a moment. The screen just froze. I've got a hand up here from DP. Sorry, I can't see the name at this second. Jeffrey, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Jeff Brust with New Jersey's Bureau of Marine Fisheries. And first, I want to say thank you to both EPA and the Army Corps staff for putting this presentation together. Hugely helpful for me. I think it's going to be helpful for our constituents who are online as well. I had a question, though, about potential sites. I believe one of the charts showed that you eliminated sand borrow sites as potential sites for the dredge material. And I'm wondering, we're hearing recently that the New York District of Army Corps is looking for a new sand borrow site because their current site for the Seabright to Manasquan beach region is almost depleted. And so they're looking for a new site. And so we've essentially removed that habitat to put it on the beach. And we know that these sand borrow sites do not recover naturally, at least not in any human time scales. And so we've removed that habitat, and now we're looking at altering habitat by placing material elsewhere. Has there been any consideration for using once the sand borrow site is depleted, to use that as the dredge disposal site? It's already been modified, so why not use it, modify it more and prevent modifying some natural habitat? Thank you.
That's a great question, Jeff. Arsheen or Kelly, can I bounce that question to you, please?
Hi, Jeff. I think just to better understand the borrow area that you're referring to, I believe it may fall outside the 40-mile radius. Am I correct? I apologize. I'm not very well familiar with some of the southern borrow areas along our AOR, our jurisdiction. Could I just ask for that follow-up?
Yeah, I guess I don't know for sure, but it was Jason Shea with the New York District is the project manager.
Yes.
And I do have plots. I don't have them in front of me now. I'm working off my phone right now, but yeah, we can figure that out. And maybe I thought it was within the 40-mile radius, but I could be wrong. But I mean, that would certainly be a consideration. But yeah, I guess I can follow up on that. But if it is within the 40-mile radius, would there be any reason not to use it, I guess, is my question.
I would actually extend that same question over to EPA as well. I don't know if that's one of the alternatives that, as we've discussed today, but I think this forum is to receive comments as you've provided, and it allows for further evaluation. And EPA folks, please step in and correct me if I'm wrong in that. But yeah, I think on from our end on Army Corps, I'll definitely look into it and flag any plots or any information I can provide to EPA from that side on the borrow side that you're referring to.
I guess.
Thank you.
Could I just jump in real quick as far as Jeff? I mean, that's what we're here for. We're here to hear about other alternatives. You know, I think we probably need to get more information from you about that to evaluate and screen whether or not you know, it could work. I think some of it depends. Many of the borrow areas that are used for beach nourishment projects are, you know, in high energy environments, and you know that wouldn't be conducive to any material from you know, it wouldn't be able to deal with the full universe of material that we're trying to manage here. But it certainly is something that we would want to know about in terms of alternatives for being able to you know, redirect some of the sand that might not align with other projects. I think that's you know, it sort of fits into the portfolio, but I don't know if it necessarily addresses the need that we have here, which is to come up with a comprehensive strategy for managing all of our material. So, but please do follow up with us, Jeff, and provide us some more information so we can evaluate that.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the answers.
And thank you for hosting us at that council meeting. It was very helpful.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So we've got one comment in the chat from Bonnie about the observation of large amount of worms and black sediment washing up in the shoreline in Point Pleasant as dredging is happening as part of the beach replenishment project, which she obviously thinks is quite concerning, and as it is, but that I don't know if you're still on, Bunny, but I'll assure you that the dredging that takes place as part of beach nourishment is a separate project and concern than the placement of dredge material and the management of dredge material in the ocean that we're talking about here. Mark, do you want to speak to that at all?
Maybe Mark, maybe I could take that question.
Yeah, that's great, Kelly.
Yep. So that area of Point Pleasant Bayhead, I'm not familiar with that area. That's probably, I think that's part of Philadelphia district. So I would need, myself or Philadelphia district would need some more information regarding which channel this was, so that we could respond, to this question. Over.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, Bonnie, if you're still here, feel free to follow up with the Army Corps of Engineers. I'll drop their website into the chat in just a moment, but we're looking out for any other comments or questions on the folks who are online here. Michael. Michael, I saw your hand go up there. Oh, yeah, there you are. I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry, had to change my mic. I'm Michael Oriema, New Jersey Bureau of Marine Habitat and Shell Fisheries. I had I think, clarifying question on the last alternative discussed, maybe a sub-alternative that considers managing the maintenance muds and the actual native material separately. Is there does that include, I guess, consideration for using the native material specifically for the fisheries enhancement, ocean placement sites, and then the maintenance materials that are dredged for a combination of upland placement and ocean placement? Or is that sort of, are there like endless sort of versions of what that might look like as far as managing them separately? And I think the reason that question comes to mind is because it seems like it would make a lot of sense to me, at least, to try to prioritize at least a large percentage of the maintenance material that's generated, to dedicate to upland placement, or perhaps even some sort of returning sediment to the river systems from which I assume a lot of it originally came, to quote unquote keep sediment in the systems. So I guess the question is, well, yeah, could you elaborate on what that looks like? And I guess the comment is, I suppose, prioritization of the maintenance dredged material to at least some of the upland or upriver sites, or if those are considered the same things, it should definitely be a consideration, recognizing that there are significant cost differences and such. Sure, that will be discussed in the management documents that come from this, but yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to drop the link in the chat to the recent Army Corps dredge material management plan, which is going to go into a much more significant amount of detail concerning sort of the considerations that the Army Corps has made in terms of, you know, the destination for maintenance material from the harbor, which will speak to you know, upland versus ocean management. But please, Arsheen or Kelly, if you want to jump in on that, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. This is Arsheen. So yeah, with regards to our project areas within the harbor, with you know, that we work with their main navigation channels, our shipping lines, I think a lot of those areas placement further upland from there or upriver from there typically is just I believe I want to say not necessarily feasible, as that material is, it's very high velocity areas, and that material is essentially coming back into those navigation areas. But in some spaces, like for one example I can think of is, you know, Shark River Inlet, where we do a lot of work. It may be possible to kind of place it near shore as well. But as Nick pointed out, a lot of that decision making that goes into where a project material may be placed is done on a project by project basis, where it is possible, where we can match a placement site that is very and beneficial use of that material is also considered. It is documented in our dredge material management plan, where we have highlighted different assessments and different considerations. I would definitely invite you to take a look, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any follow-up questions following that review as well.
Can I just add just a sort of EPA comment? E- um, EPA is very committed to looking for alternatives, and you know, we work with a variety of stakeholders towards that end. We have a regional dredging team that stays in contact and meets quarterly to talk about different options, and we've identified various opportunities. There's you know, there's various challenges associated with dredge material, and you know, one of the challenges, you know, for at least New York Harbor, is that there's not a lot of landside opportunity for you know, getting that material to any potential beneficial reuse. So I'll just say that, you know, it's sort of an active area where people are continuing to look for and brainstorm for opportunities. But, you know, there's sort of an economic reality as well, particularly in New York Harbor, where it often involves quite a bit of handling and rehandling and transportation costs that just you know, blow up the economic feasibility of many of these options. Things like sand, you know, that's something that's, you know, a desired resource and is, you know, actively placed. It's pursued by folks, and that it's often, you know, more a logistical question of, you know, can we somehow figure out to feed, you know, what turns out to be a relatively small amount of the material to that project while maintaining, you know, the realities of having to move a lot of other materials. So it's like aligning some of those logistics. It's very, very complicated, but, you know, as sort of a matter of policy and priority, you know, everybody is committed to trying to maximize beneficial reuse. You know, we in the dredge material management community do not look at, you know, most dredge material as you know, a problem, but rather, you know, a missed opportunity. And so we're continuing those conversations. So you know, thanks for the comment. I mean, that's definitely where we're at. It's just, it's a very tricky thing to actually put together.
Thank you. I appreciate it and understand there are a lot of challenges associated with moving dredge material. So I do have a follow-up and completely sort of unrelated comment too. I think that the having seen and worked with a lot of the commercial fisheries data that's presented and sort of the analysis, the alternative analysis for the different areas. I know that there are not really many other sources of more recent data that are publicly available when it comes to VMS data um, and the VTR data with regards to overlaps of fishing activity. But I think the report, I think there should be acknowledgement of the data gap in the timeline that's available. I think the most recent data that is available is 2019 from there, and recognizing that there's a 6-year sort of lag, the fishing activity, you know, might have changed over time since that happened, and that continued engagement with the commercial and recreational industry, like you guys have demonstrated in the presentation, is going to be important for you to include. I think going off of Gus's comments from earlier, knowing that they might, a lot of fishing activity might not be readily sort of demonstrated in the available data. It's good to show that whatever engagement that you've had with the industry shows that it at least gets a more holistic view and at least as best possible represented from a temporal perspective, knowing that you've considered those options when it comes to, or those issues when it comes to selecting, or the possibility of selecting a site for fishery habitat enhancement or whatever. That just something that I think should be included in the report, so the fishing industry knows that you've done your due diligence to make sure that all of their considerations or needs are have at least been looked at, further than whatever's the easiest and most recently available data that's online. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That's a fantastic comment. I would definitely ask you to submit that in as a written comment to our email as well. I know that, in sort of our preliminary, swings at this, that, aside from the engagement that we've had with the fishing industry, that like the actual VMS data is something that, we're aware of, but I think your perspective on that should be noted in writing as well. We're just going to keep the floor open here. So if anybody thinks of something, we're hanging out.
Well, to fill the dead air, I'll just say that in follow up, Michael, I mean that's part of this process, right? I mean, we're trying to get the word out that this is what we're doing, to solicit comments on things that aren't publicly available, but sort of intimate or industry specific knowledge, and the types of things that we've heard before about these areas that our exercise identified as a likely area, but that is doesn't sort of reflect what the situation is on the ground. That's what we're trying to get out of this process is that type of perspective. So definitely we'll annotate that we have reached out and we have tried to coordinate. We made sure as part of this process to make sure that the fishery management councils received an invitation and asked them to distribute it further, because we know that there are gaps in this, and it is important for us to hear from the people that are sort of a little closer to it and might have the information on the ground that we're not getting, like you said, until 6 years later.
Yeah, Tim, you got your hand up?
Yes, thanks. Thanks for having the session. It's been very informative. Tim Dillingham, I'm the Executive Director of the American Littoral Society. We're a conservation organization based out of Sandy Hook. I guess one comment, just to go back to my earlier question, Mark, I'm not sure in your answer I heard sort of an evaluation of the overall status of how well the HARS remediation is working. I appreciate the fact that when you find the hotspots, so to speak, right, through the monitoring, that you have a process to go back and recap them to limit that exposure. And it would seem to me that if you have some assessment of that condition across the entire site, it would inform whether or not the future management options ought to be to continue to put, clean stuff or harsh qualified stuff on top of the site, as opposed to going to a new site. So I don't know whether that information, on a overall site is scale is available in the scientific review committee's analysis or stuff that they put into, but I would look for that. And I mean, it seems to me that if, really it comes down to if the job is not done, so to speak, right, even though the capacity limits have been met, that continuing to seal that contamination off from the ecosystem, which should be a priority. But secondly, I guess my question second question would be, we've lost a tremendous amount of tidal wetlands, both in terms of acreage and elevation, historically, and now under the impacts of climate. Is there I'm not aware, maybe it's in the dredge management plan that was posted, but is there an inventory of sort of capacity that might be available, volume, if you were to restore tidal wetlands out to the state of New Jersey's tidal management tide line, the wetlands delineation lines? Because that would be a preference, obviously, to putting it back in the open ocean under any condition, is to restore the tidal wetlands themselves, which NOAA and EPA and others have done very successfully, up in the Meadowlands and the Kills and other places. But assessing, what that overall opportunity, what portion of the 21 million cubic yards remaining might fit based on quality and volume into rebuilding the tidal wetlands base that we've lost would be a tremendous gain from an ecological perspective.
So Tim, I'm sure you're aware of like the CRIP, the Comprehensive Restoration Plan that's come up for at least I'm sort of harbor specific in my sort of purview. But there are various plans for where things might be sited. Again, I'll just sort of go back to, we're actively looking to be partners in any beneficial use opportunities for dredge material. And when I talk about dredge material, I'm talking about everything from rock to sand to mud to clay to till. There's certain uses for certain ones, and to date, at least in the New York Harbor area, there has not been much interest in anything other than sand and relatively small amounts of sand. So I think that we would welcome an opportunity to do demonstration projects with additional types of material, and we certainly, at least the EPA and the Corps, described their commitment to beneficial use. Would be looking for these opportunities for larger scale projects. Often, the projects that are contemplated just simply are too small, or built too slowly to keep up with the infrastructure, maintenance needs that we're dealing with in the dredging, world.
I hear you, and I'm glad to hear about the openness. I guess a couple of thing. One is I was a little bit responding to the comment about, it's ad hoc is probably too strong a way to describe it, but matching opportunities to the projects as you go along, as opposed to developing a management plan, which looks out longer in time and tries to meet these anticipated needs. On the scale of the projects, I would probably offer somebody who my organization does a lot of habitat restoration work. It's because there isn't a framework, right? There isn't a driver to build those wetlands, right? Very limited funding. Some of the NRDA dollars that come in are the ones that allow for the big projects to happen. So I don't think it's because of a lack of opportunity or scale. I think it's other factors that this process might have the opportunity to change fundamentally. And I don't know whether it's been a while since I've looked at the harbor plan, but to know whether or not there are estimated volumes at each of those sites. But there are, as you know, a lot of opportunities that the habitat committees have happened and others have identified. So this is an opportunity to really, give some teeth to the beneficial reuse commitment that you all have set out for yourself, which is very commendable.
Hey, Tim, it's Arsheen from the Army Corps. I just wanted to quickly chime in as well from the Army Corps side. Definitely recognize that there are these amazing, what we're also calling these matchmaking opportunities that may be present. And it's something that here at the Corps, we've definitely taken a fresher look at, especially considering with WARDA 2020, the changes that came about from WARDA 2020, and as well as Kelly had mentioned at the start of this meeting about our beneficial use philosophy document, that goal that we're talking about of keeping the 70% beneficial use of our material by 2030. So definitely in light of those changes as well, it's something that we here at the Corps are definitely prioritizing, and we've been holding more of these sessions with our colleagues here at the Nature Conservancy, with Fish and Wildlife Service, as well, trying to better identify more of these sites, these different restoration opportunities that may be present, and how we can line them up with our projects. In addition to that, when we started preparing our dredge material management plan update as well, we did a lot of outreach, and we tried to solicit feedback from groups like the Meadowland Research Institute through NJSEA, and some other local, restoration groups as well, to try to incorporate their upcoming projects and where they may have potential placement opportunities coming up as part of our effort. And we will be continuing to do that as we work on a longer term dredge material management plan that looks 20 years out, and we'll continue to prioritize these matchmaking opportunities going forward.
Great, thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tim. Again, we encourage you to reiterate that in writing to our email as well. I think, suffice it to say that all sides see the opportunity at play, and we all want to create whatever communication channels are necessary to actualize all of those beneficial use opportunities. Absolutely. We do have one more question in the chat from Bonnie. Would the public be able to view any information found based on where monitors are monitoring, I guess, is located for dredging or replenishment projects, just given that marine life has been affected in the past? Bonnie, I would just ask if you could sort of clarify whether or not you're curious about public information being available about monitoring of dredged material in the ocean, or monitoring of dredged material that is being used for beach nourishment or wetland restoration. If you can jump on the unmute, that's fine, or you can drop it in the chat. How it relates to oceans and bays. So I think that your question is referring to sort of public information about the monitoring information, some of that we presented here. On our website, there is a link to a fact sheet, as well as linking to the national website for the EPA, for the Marine Protection Resources and Sanctuaries Act, that can give sort of more a general overview of the type of monitoring that's done. More specifically, I don't know if Jordan, if you have anything further to clarify on that can help sort of give Bonnie a better idea of monitoring information.
Yeah, I'm not sure specific information this question is after, but I will say also linked on our website is the most recent SMMP, which I think this speaks a little bit to Tim's question as well, in terms of looking at contaminant concentrations in our disposal site, in the like historic area remediation site over time. and some of the monitoring information or comparative look at since the HARS designation until the most recent SMMP, which is in 2020. There's been some analysis there, but otherwise I'm not entirely sure specifically related to this comment, but that's where some of our monitoring work is outlined, is on the website and in the SMMP, which is linked there.
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, Bonnie, I think as Jordan just said, the SMMP is a really great place to start in terms of, understanding sort of the type of monitoring that we do in greater detail and what some of the historical trends are. Yeah, thanks, Pat. SMMP, Site Management and Monitoring Plan. Yeah, and while we're on the topic of the site management monitoring plan, just to reiterate a little bit about this process, since we're getting close to the end of our meeting window time here for those that are still on, the environmental review document that is being developed, this process that we're here for is for stakeholder input to help us develop environmental review alternatives for the continued management of dredged material on the New York Bight. All of this information will be used to help develop those alternatives. Then there will be a draft of the environmental review, as well as a draft of a new site management monitoring plan. And that will then also, those drafts will then also be available for public review and comment before the final draft of this document and the ultimate identification of what the option that is most favorable environmentally and publicly. And the timeline is expected to be towards the end of the calendar year for the finalization of that document. Again, if you can please submit your comments by email to region2_NPRSA@epa.gov by Monday, July 14th, which is the close of the public comment period. Thank you very much for your participation in the process. And we've got a lot of really great insights from a lot of folks. And we look forward to hearing from you on our email. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the meeting. It looks like we've got people dropping off. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Swarna. Everyone have a safe evening.